What is up, everyone? Welcome to another Wikipedia Deep Dive. Today we will be talking about the French New Wave. So what exactly is the French New Wave? Well, if you ever heard Quentin Tarantino talk about anything, well, especially in his early career, you're going to hear about the French New Wave. So, New Wave, La Nouvelle Vague, is a French art film movement which emerged in the late 1950s. The movement was characterized by its rejection of traditional filmmaking and conventions in favor of experimentation and a spirit of iconoclasm. Definitely heard Tarantino use that word before. New Wave filmmakers New Wave filmmakers explored new approaches to editing, visual style, and narrative, as well as engagement with the social and political upheavals of the era, often making use of irony or exploring existential themes. So if I were to go by just that bit alone, I'd say oh, they're hipsters. The New Wave is often considered one of the most influential movements in the history of cinema. So a quick aside, if you've ever seen that thing where in movies where they do jump cuts and they end a movie on a still frame, we got it from the French New Wave. The term was first used by a group of French film critics and cinephiles, not that other word, associated with the magazine Cahiers du Cinéma in the late 1950s and 1960s. These critics rejected the tradition of quality of mainstream French cinema, which emphasized craft over innovation and old works over experimentation. So I'm guessing that these people wouldn't have liked Marvel films. This was apparent in a manifesto-like 1954 essay by François Truffaut, Une certaine tendance du cinéma français. I probably butchered that, where he denounced the adaptation of safe literary works into unimaginative films. Along with Truffaut, a number of writers for Cahiers du Cinéma became leading New Wave filmmakers, including Jean-Luc Godard, Eric Rohmer, Jacques Rivette, and Claude Chabrol. The associated left-bank film community included directors such as Alain Resnais, Agnès Varda, and Chris Marker. Using portable equipment and requiring little or no setup time, the New Wave way of filmmaking often presented a documentary style. The films exhibited direct sounds on film stock that required less light. Filming techniques included fragmented, discontinuous editing and long takes. The combination of realism, subjectivity, and authorial commentary created a narrative ambiguity in the sense that questions that arise in a film are not answered in the end. So, if you've ever seen some weird movie that doesn't look that great, where you're like, what's going on? You can blame the French New Wave. Origins of the movement. Alexandre Astruc's manifesto, The Birth of a New Avant-Garde, the Camera Stylo, published in L'Écran on the 30th of March 1948, outlined some of the ideas that were later expanded upon by François Truffaut and Cahiers du Cinéma. It argues that cinema was in the process of becoming a new means of expression on the same level as painting and the novel. Okay, I can agree with that. A form in which and by which an artist can express his thoughts, however abstract they may be, or translate his obsessions exactly as he does in the contemporary essay or novel. This is why I would like to call this new age of cinema the age of the Camera Stylo. Some of the most prominent pioneers among the group, including François Truffaut, Jean-Luc Godard, Eric Rohmer, Claude Chabrol, and Jacques Rivette, began as critics for the famous film magazine Cahiers du Cinéma. Okay, I've got to give them this. There are a lot of people who nag and whine about films, and that's all they ever do. But these dudes, they went ahead and well, the movies I'm watching, they suck, so I'm going to make one. So they did more than a lot of people. Cahir's co-founder and theorist André Bazin was a prominent source of influence for the movement. By means of criticism and editorialization, they laid the groundwork for a set of concepts revolutionary at the time, which the American film critic Andrew Sarris called auteur theory. The original French La politique des auteurs, translated literally as the policy of authors. Bazin and Henry Langlois, founder and curator of the Cinémathèque Française, were the dual father figures of the movement. These men of cinema valued the expression of the director's personal vision in both the film's style and script. Truffaut also credits the American film Little Fugitive by Ruth Orkin, Ray Ashley, and Maurice Engel with helping to start the French New Wave move. When he said, "Our French New Wave would never have come into being if it hadn't been for the young American Maurice Engel, who showed us the way to independent production with this fine movie." The auteur theory holds that the director is the author of his/her movies, with a personal signature visible from film to film. They praised movies by Jean Renoir, Jean Vigo, and made then radical cases for the artistic distinction and greatness of Hollywood studio directors such as Orson Welles, John Ford, Alfred Hitchcock, and Nicholas Ray. The beginning of the New Wave was to some extent an exercise by the Cahir's writers in applying this philosophy to the world by directing movies themselves. Apart from the role that films by Jean Roch have played in the movement, Chabrol's La Bourse Serge is traditionally, but debatably, credited as the first New Wave feature. Agnes Varda's La Pointe Courte was chronologically the first, but did not have a commercial release until 2008. What? That's kind of mental. Truffaut with the 400 Blows and Godard with Breathless had unexpected international success, both critical and financial, that turned the world's attention to the activities of the New Wave and enabled the movement to flourish. Part of their technique was to portray characters not readily labeled as protagonists in the classic sense of audience identification. The auteurs of this era owe their popularity to the support they received with their youthful audience. Most of these directors were born in the 1930s and grew up in Paris, relating to how their viewers might be experiencing life. With high concentration in fashion, urban professional life, and all-night parties, the life of France's youth was being exquisitely captured. The French New Wave was popular roughly between 1958 and 1962. The socio-economic forces at play shortly after World War II strongly influenced the movement. Politically and financially drained, France tended to fall back on the old popular pre-war traditions. One such tradition was straight narrative cinema, specifically classical French film. The movement has its roots in rebellion against the reliance on past forms, often adapted from traditional novelistic structures, criticizing in particular the way these forms could force the audience to submit to a dictatorial plotline. They were especially against the French cinema of quality, the type of high-minded, literary period films held in esteem at French film festivals, often regarded as untouchable by criticism. New Wave critics and directors studied the work of Western classics and applied new avant-garde stylistic direction. The low-budget approach helped filmmakers get at the essential art form and find what was, to them, a much more comfortable and contemporary form of production. Charlie Chaplin, Alfred Hitchcock, Orson Welles, Howard Hawks, John Ford, Sam Fuller, and Don Siegel were held up in admiration. French New Wave is influenced by Italian neorealism and classical Hollywood cinema. In a 1961 interview, Truffaut said that the New Wave is neither a movement nor a school nor a group. It's a quality, and December 1962 published a list of 162 film directors who had made their feature film debut since 1959. Many of these directors, such as Edmond Agabra and Henry Zaffiratos, were not as successful or enduring as the well-known members of the French New Wave, and today would not be considered part of it. Shortly after Truffaut's published list appeared, Godard publicly declared that the New Wave was more exclusive, and only included Truffaut, Chabrol, Rivette, Romer, and himself, stating that Cahir's was the nucleus of the movement. Godard also acknowledged filmmakers such as Resnais, Astruc, Varda, and Demy as esteemed contemporaries, but said that they represented their own fund of culture and were separate from the New Wave. Many of the directors associated with the New Wave continued to make films into the 21st century. Film techniques. The movies featured unprecedented methods of expression, such as long tracking shots, like the famous traffic jam sequence in Godard's 1967 film Weekend. Also, these movies featured existential themes, often stressing the individual and the acceptance of the absurdity of human existence. Filled with irony and sarcasm, the films also tend to reference other films. So that's where Tarantino got the idea from. Many of the French New Wave films were produced on tight budgets, often shot in a friend's apartment or yard, using the director's friends as the cast and crew. Directors were also forced to improvise with equipment, for example, using a shopping cart for tracking shots. The cost of film was also a major concern, thus effort to save film turned into stylistic innovations. For example, in Jean-Luc Godard's Breathless, after being told the film was too long and he must cut it down to 1 hour and a half, he decided to remove several scenes from the feature using jump cuts, as they were filmed in one long take. Parts that did not work were simply cut from the middle of the take, a practical decision and also a purposeful stylistic one. The cinematic styling of French New Wave brought a fresh look to cinema with improvised dialogue, rapid changes of a scene, and shots that broke the common 180 axis of camera movement. In many films of the French New Wave, the camera was used not to mesmerize the audience with elaborate narrative and illusory images, but rather to play with audience expectations. Godard was obviously the movement's most influential figure. His method of filmmaking, often used to shock an audiences out of passivity, was abnormally bold and direct. Godard's stylistic approach can be seen as a desperate struggle against the mainstream cinema of the time, or a degrading attack on the viewer's supposed naivete. Either way, the challenging awareness represented by this movement remains in cinema today. Effects that now seem either trite or commonplace, such as a character stepping out of their role in order to address the audience directly, were radically innovative at the time. Classic French cinema adhered to the principle of strong narrative, creating what Godard described as an oppressive and deterministic aesthetic of plot. In contrast, New Wave filmmakers made no attempts to suspend the viewer's disbelief. In fact, they took steps to constantly remind the viewer that a film is just a sequence of moving images, no matter how clever the use of light and shadow. The result is a set of oddly disjointed scenes without attempt at unity, or an actor whose character changes from one scene to the next, or sets in which onlookers accidentally make their way onto camera along with extras, who in fact were hired to do just the same. At the heart of the New Wave technique is the issue of money and production value. In the context of social and economic troubles of a post-World War II France, filmmakers sought low-budget alternatives to the usual production methods and were inspired by the generation of Italian neorealists before them. Half necessity and half vision, New Wave directors used all that they had available to channel their artistic visions directly to the theater. Finally, the French New Wave, as the European modern cinema, is focused on the technique as style itself. A French New Wave filmmaker is first of all an author who shows in his film their own eye on the world. On the other hand, the film as the object of knowledge challenges the usual transitivity on which all the other cinema was based, undoing its cornerstones, space and time, continuity, narrative and grammatical logics, the self-evidence of the represented world. In this way, the filmmaker passes the essay attitude, thinking, in a novelist way, on his own way to do essays. The left bank. The corresponding right bank group is constituted... Where's my ability to read gone? The corresponding right bank group oh my goodness, I'm doing so bad. Constituted. Why did I have trouble with this word? Okay, take 3. The corresponding right bank group is constituted Of the more famous and financially successful New Wave directors associated with Cahiers du Cinéma, Claude Chabrol, François Truffaut, and Jean-Luc Godard. Unlike the Cahiers group, left bank directors were older and less movie crazed. They tended to see cinema akin to other arts such as literature. However, they were similar to the New Wave directors in that they practiced cinematic modernism. Their emergence also came in the 1950s, and they also benefited from the youthful audience. The two groups, however, were not in opposition. Cahiers du Cinéma advocated for left bank cinema. Left bank directors include Chris Marker, Alain Resnais, and Agnes Varda. Rao described a distinctive fondness for a kind of bohemian life and impatience with the conformity of the right bank, a high degree of involvement in literature and the plastic arts, and a consequent interest in experimental filmmaking, as well as an identification with the political left. The filmmakers tended to collaborate with one another. Jean-Pierre Melville, Alain Robbe-Grillet, and Marguerite Duras were also associated with the group. The Nouvelle Roman movement in literature was also a strong element of the left bank style, with authors contributing to many of the films. Left bank films include La Pointe Courte, Hiroshima Mon Amour, La Jetée, Last Year at Marienbad, and Trans-Europe Express. Influential names in the New Wave. Let's see. There's a whole list. At this point, it would just be like a genealogy. So, at this point, I'll just stop reading the Wikipedia and just comment about two of the most influential figures, Jean-Luc Godard and François Truffaut. So, what's really interesting is, like, these two dudes both, in a way, their great commonality is, like, they didn't want to be told how to make a movie. They're both like, well, why do we have to do it this way? And I kind of feel like Jean-Luc Godard was like, I'm going to make something weird and unintelligible just because, and I'm going to be cool for it. Whereas François Truffaut was like, I'm not setting out to make a movement or start something. I'm just making movies the way I want to. And you could argue that François Truffaut was the more relatable and, accessible filmmaker. But at the same time, you could argue that, because of all the out there stuff Jean-Luc Godard did, people felt free to explore certain ideas. I guess it's kind of like, how Kevin Smith talked about seeing Slacker, where it's like, okay, if this counts as a movie, then I can give it a shot. I could do that. And maybe ideas that people thought they had, that they thought were maybe a bit too out there, were like, okay, in comparison, maybe my idea is doable. So this felt relatively short. It was only about 18 minutes compared to the last video I did. So that is the French New Wave cinema. I might do some videos specifically about Godard and Truffaut later on. But for now, that, as Porky Pig would say, that's all, folks.